Ancient civilizations are being discovered in the South American rainforest that may hold valuable lessons for today. Hello everybody, I'm Charna Davis-Wiese and welcome to UCF Profiles. Joining us today is Dr. John Walker from the UCF Department of Anthropology. It seems that I really like your department because I get a lot of your colleagues on. Anthropology, I think, is so incredibly fascinating. And looking into some of the things that you do, you think of the average person thinking of ancient peoples thousands of years ago being semi-uncivilized and maybe not very smart. And in reality, in some ways, they might have been more clever than some civilizations today.
There's a really good reason to believe that, especially in the part of the world where I work, in South America, in the Amazon. It's really a place where over decades, one development project after another has come and failed. And what we're finding through archaeology is that people who lived in that part of the world in the past had very sophisticated ways of living and of farming and maintaining large numbers of people in a way that really hasn't been duplicated since.
They figured it out. They figured it out in more ways than people maybe are today. Now, there are some areas where it's very dry and arid some of the year and floods other parts of the year. So the current thought is you can't really do anything with this land.
Well, and it's such a huge place. The Amazon is as big as the continental United States. So it would be a mistake to say, oh, well, the weather in the United States is all the same, or it's all mountains, or it's all forest. So that's one of the things that really makes the archaeology of the Amazon exciting to me, is that it's this continental-sized area, and there's just been very little work done there. So all the basic things that we associate with archaeology, we're still in the middle of doing them. We're decades or even centuries behind archaeology in other places, but that makes it kind of exciting for us.
You know, that's what always amazes me talking with the Chases or meeting you and reading about this, is that you have an area that is so vast, whether a quarter of the world's water is there and a third of the species, and it's so enormous, is how you guys find a place. I mean, it's some of these places that we're going to look at today, and the photographs we're going to look at today, is really under a lot of thousands of years of vegetation, isn't it?
It's true. It's true. And one of the things that makes us excited about this particular place that I work in, the Bolivian Amazon, is that we're finding the sort of indisputable remains of people living there. That is to say, they're agricultural fields, things that there's no non-human explanation for. And we're finding them all over the place. We're finding them all over the savanna, the sort of grassland that we see around here in central Florida. And we're also finding them underneath what people would think of as old growth or primary growth forest. So however old those big trees are, those particular big trees, they seem to be growing on top of pre-Columbian, that is to say, Native American raised fields. So
how do you find these spots underneath the rainforest?
Well, that's a great question. Maybe I can show you one picture here.
I love these things. You can just bring your whole history right here to our set. Now, these are images of Bolivia?
That's right. This is the eastern part of Bolivia, the Bolivian Amazon. And you'll see that question of how we find these things really isn't so complex when you get off the ground and you go up in the air. Because this is
fly over.
This is a picture from a light airplane, a single-engine airplane, and you can see these oblongs, these sort of light-colored rectangles, are those agricultural fields that I'm talking about. They're about 200 yards long and 20 yards wide, and you can't miss them. But if you were to look at them from ground level, it would be very easy to miss them because the grass is as tall as a person, and they can be very difficult to find. So we rely a lot on things like aerial photographs, satellite images, and different kinds of analysis of those kinds of resources.
So it could almost be serendipity. Somebody flies over and says, what are those?
And it really was. The history of the research in the early 1960s was a geographer, a man named Denovan, who was interested in other problems and studying other things in that place. And he flew over and he said, well, stop the presses. I have to work on this because no one knows about it. And so that kind of that fact is kind of what's drawn us to this particular place. But that's only one spot in this gigantic area. So there really is archaeology just about everywhere. It's just a question of where the archaeologists have been able to work.
These particular raised fields, to think of that long ago, how they put that kind of labor into it. You know, it's the old story of the pyramids all over again, but in a smaller frame. It had to be very, very difficult to make that work, but I guess they needed it to survive.
Well, and that's a great question. That really goes to the heart of one of the things that I'm interested in, which is trying to go to a connection between this kind of farming and all these things that people built essentially by piling up earth. Try and look at those and find something out about the social organization or the society that built them. Right? It's kind of a tough leap, but it's the kind of thing that we like to try to do. And one of the things that we find out by essentially by doing an experiment is, let's go to some people who live in this place today and ask them, and with a sort of a development grant, have them build some of these fields again. And that's very valuable for us because it helps us interpret the archaeological remains. And we're hopeful that it could conceivably be a theme in development in the future, that these kinds of fields could be used again. And then there would be a benefit to the people that we're working with, in that it would be a way for them to do agriculture today.
So there you have the idea from the past, perhaps helping them do something with this land they may not think they could do anything with in the future. What level are they at now? Where are they now? Are they actually building them? Are they built? Or are they?
Well, it's a complex problem, and as you can imagine, if it's in a society today, there are lots of different people who are interested in it and people who aren't interested in it. So it's not. These fields aren't being renovated and used all across the Amazon, but we have made some efforts towards reconstruction, and there are a number of those fields that have been rebuilt. And the interesting thing is that people are using them even after the development money goes away. That is to say, there's some sustainability that people are continuing to work.
They work.
Even though they're not
the fields work.
They seem to work. We know a lot more about this kind of agriculture from a highland setting than we do here in the lowlands, but there is some evidence that it works, and that it works in a different way, and in some ways, I guess you could argue, a better way than some of the other alternatives. Are
they interconnected with other areas as well?
Well, this particular kind of technology, it would probably be a mistake to focus too much on it as, sort of a magic technology or a silver bullet or something. It's a way that farmers improve the land for their own use. And there are ways that Native Americans did that or similar things all the way across the continent, from here in eastern Bolivia all the way up through all the different kinds of intensive agriculture in the Caribbean, the Valley of Mexico, all the way up into North America, up into the upper Midwest. We see things like this. So I guess my point of view is that farmers tend to be pretty ingenious people, and they tend to be pretty knowledgeable about the particular place where they live and farm. And so there are a lot of solutions like this that are around the world, and especially in the Americas, that show how farmers change their environment and live in it, live with it, and live in it in a sort of a dynamic way.
And even today, they have to be fluid. They have to be willing to say, as you said, change, and they have to somehow try to control something where they have so little control of the weather or conditions that suddenly can come out of nowhere and totally destroy them.
That's right. That's right.
And they had the same problems then.
That's true. That's true. And I think that pictures like that and systems like that we see are the result of many generations of farmers dealing with that environment and building these kinds of fields and making these kinds of improvements that help them deal with those problems.
What got you there to Bolivia?
Well,
where did you get that interest come from?
I really am very fortunate in my life to have had some great teachers. And I had a great teacher in high school that pushed me towards history and archaeology, and I had another great teacher as an undergrad. And then I had a great teacher in grad school who worked in Bolivia, and the very first summer, I guess, of my graduate career, he sort of pushed me out the door to go to Ecuador and to go to South America, and I loved it. I just fell in love with South America. And then the next summer we went down as a project, a number of us, half from the US and half from Bolivia, and it's just one of the most amazing places I've ever been, and the people there are some of the most hospitable, I think, that I've ever been around. So it's just, I really enjoy living there and working there.
And it's so different. I had to cover war, actually, in an earthquake in El Salvador. And I remember driving into the country and never seeing such beautiful countryside and how amazing it was. And I remember the officials telling us there was a certain area of that you were not allowed to go into, that it was very dangerous. And being young and somewhat foolish, my cameraman and I decided we're going to go. Right. And what it was basically women and children living in these, it was almost cardboard and siding tent kind of areas, working and trying to be clean and having these wonderful little communities. They just didn't want us to see that or film it. But like you say, they were so warm and so friendly, so excited to see us that I can see how it became infectious and you want to go back because it's so different than what we're used to, everybody honking and yelling at each other on the streets. Very different world. It is, it is. But it's a beautiful place and it's a great place, and I really have made some long-term friends there, some friends that I really treasure. Just one of the stories I would tell is the idea that if we're out traveling in the, as far from electricity and no cars, no trucks, no electricity, nothing, and we were traveling in a boat and we pull up to someone's ranch and it's late in the evening and we're hoping to ask them permission to camp on their property, and you go up the bank and you talk to this person and he says, well, come in and have something to drink and sit down and have something to eat. And after maybe a half an hour, he says, now, so tell me, what is it that you're doing on my land? And it's a very different experience than you'd have when you're doing field work in the United States or really in most places. There's Mi casa es su casa. My house is your house. That's a lot of the that's a lot of the idea. So how much of the year do you actually go and live there?
Well, the longest I've ever been there was about 15 months in 1996 and 97. And now that I have a faculty position, I'm hoping to go for a month or two every summer. That would be my sort of long-term plan, to try and maintain that presence and keep the research moving.
Cool. We'll talk more about that in a minute, and we'll be right back. We're talking to Dr. John Walker from the UCF Anthropology Department, and we're taking a look at some of the pictures here on his trusty laptop of some of your research and travels to Bolivia and some of the anthropological situations and sites and things you're looking at. So show us, what are some of these people?
Sure.
You've got here?
Let me show you, well, let me show you this. This is a picture of us at our, this is the family that I live with when I'm in a particular town, and what's going on in this picture is that my colleague Georgina Bocchetti and I are investigating a particular kind of artifact. We're trying to sort of do an experiment and see if we can use this particular kind of pot to grate different kinds of foods. And it's actually, as you can see in the picture, it's turning out very well. We're grating a lot of manioc or cassava, which is a root crop, and we're using it on all kinds of other vegetables. And it seems to be a very useful or a very practical way of chopping up and sort of turning into pulp these different kinds of foods. This is part of what we do when we're trying to analyze some of the artifacts that we find.
If you actually try to use them, you can know what they did with them.
That's right. That's right. And we, let me see if I can just scroll
And those are
down
the
to
kids that
another
live
picture.
there? Those?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And in this same house, maybe I can just show this one other one. In that same house is a small museum that we've established that I should say I'm sort of an advisor for. I'm helping the people in this small town, Santa Ana, set up their museum. And it's one room, and it has a number of artifact cases and a number of exhibits on the wall. But this is really, I think this is really kind of the future of, well, and it's really the present of archaeology in a lot of places, especially in Latin America, where people in those countries very naturally and of course are very interested in archaeology, and they're the ones that are beginning to decide what's important, and they're the ones that are beginning to advise us, the archaeologists who come from other countries, what's important to them, what they think should be done, and I think that's a very positive development.
Because I think you need to have the funding, you need the permission, you need to have all of that, and I guess they can look at it as a way to maybe generate some tourism.
That's very true. That's very true. We usually give talks in the different towns that we're in Bolivia, and sometimes it'll be 10 or 12 people who have a sort of an interest in archaeology, and then one time we gave a talk, or I gave a talk, and suddenly there were 30 young people there. The people in that particular town you might not think would be interested in archaeology, and they were all studying tourism. They were all very interested in the idea of how archaeology could be a part of tourism in Bolivia.
What is the most interesting thing you found? Is there anything that you found that was really unusual or really different or really old or something that really was an excitement for you?
Well, I'd have to say, that's a tough question. The kind of archaeology I do doesn't lend itself to the sort of spectacular find, but I have had a chance to excavate what's called an urn burial. In this part of the world, many burials are secondary burials, that is to say the body is treated in some way and then the bones are buried in a vessel, in a pot. And we excavated one of those burials, a skeleton inside of a large, about this big around vessel. So that was exciting, because sort of from the knowledge that it was a very that there had not been much other research like that done. So I'd say that was exciting for me.
Some of the things that are being found that may or may not be some of your research, but are so interesting down there is the other quote-unquote Stonehenge type of, I don't want to call it a monument, but the situation that was found there.
Sure.
Was that surprising to find another Stonehenge-like monument still in another part of the world, still standing?
I would say in some ways it was surprising, but in other ways we should be expecting those kinds of finds all the time. That particular find was located up sort of on the other end of the river, way at the other end of the Amazon, a little bit north of the mouth of the Amazon. And it's in a place where there's a tradition of the people that live there, the Amapá, I think is their name, have done some, or we know something about their construction of stone monuments, basically standing stones. Now this find last year was really remarkable, because it wasn't just a single standing stone, it was a group of them arranged in a circle. And seemingly a strong interpretation of that is that there's some connection to astronomical events, the rising and setting of stars or the sun. So it's not such a surprise that people could have built such a thing. That is to say, we saw it being done before, and it's also not such a surprise that Native Americans are interested in astronomy, because as we look at cultures throughout South America and the Amazon, they almost all have a very sophisticated understanding of events like the rising and setting of stars and the sun. They didn't need someone to tell them, build some huge thing to tell them that the sun was going to rise on this date in this place. So it is surprising, and it's amazing to find, but it does kind of fit in with an understanding of Native Americans as being...
They would need it, especially if they were an agricultural society. They'd have to know what was going on and when.
They would have to know all of those things, and I think that it maybe we can think of monuments as a sort of an expression of that knowledge, or an expression of that interaction with the world.
One of the courses you teach is about anthropological thought. Now I imagine that means that the thought of why these things were, or how these things were, or how the societies were, changes over time?
Yeah, that's a good, I'm glad you asked that question, because it sort of feeds into it helps me talk about archaeology as part of anthropology. Even though I'm an archaeologist and I'm interested in the things that people left behind, the material remains, I'm also an anthropologist, and that means I'm interested in larger questions about society, how society works, how culture works, how people interact when they're together. And so that course on anthropological thought traces the different ideas that anthropologists have had about all kinds of questions, about politics, about economics, about gender, about basically anything that people do. And anthropologists have thought and argued and fought about those questions for 150 years. And the point of that course is to trace some of those arguments and see how they've changed our understanding, not just of how anthropologists argue with each other, which might be of interest to some people, but also how that changes anthropologists' understanding of other cultures, which has really changed a lot over the past century.
And I imagine it would also have to all be seen in the context of where you're coming from.
That's
and
true.
Your cultural experiences and what you think, well, this might mean this. An anthropologist, a man from 85 years ago might think differently, maybe an anthropologist woman today.
That's very true. That's very true.
Are there any constants, though? Are there any constants that hasn't seen a change in how cultures were then? One thing I think of was you think about the Aztecs, and you think about these societies that have, Mayan societies that have really disappeared, that we have to know what happened to them in order to see what might happen to us. So are there any concepts that we found that maybe big mistakes people have made that maybe we're making again?
It's difficult to say. I think that maybe the constant in the way we've thought over this long period of time is that it's good to argue about questions like that, because it's not always clear that there's something about those, what am I trying to say, that we as anthropologists bring a lot to our analysis of these societies we study. And so you can almost always find someone else who will weigh in and say, no, that's not the way it is, because in this group that I study, it's different. But so if there's one tension or one thing that is constant, it's definitely the arguments in anthropology. And maybe the biggest one is, do we as humans, as people, do we have more in common? Do we and the Aztecs have more in common with each other? Or are the differences, the variation in people and societies and cultures, is that more important? And that's I think that's one of the most interesting questions there could be. And it's not the kind of question that anthropology is going to find the answer to. The point is that the argument about it is going to lead us to
taking a look at what we might be doing. Back to the raised beds and the agriculture, there's so much concern for so many of us about the rainforest and what's happening to it today and what it's going to mean for our planet. Obviously, it may have been over an enormous amount of time, but it was able to regrow over some of these civilizations. Does that give us some hope that maybe it's not too late? Maybe we can, it sounds like a cliche, but save the rainforest.
No, it's a really important topic to talk about. And from my point of view, as an archaeologist who works in this place, I would say one of the keys to saving the rainforest, which is obviously a big question with a lot of people who have an interest in it, is that we should see the rainforest for what it is. We should study it, and we should find out as much about it as we can. And I think that when we do that, we see that it's part of a large, the rainforest is only part of the Amazon, and it's part of a huge complex system that involves, it involves plants and animals, it involves climate and weather and soils, and that's another very interesting topic, but it also involves people, and it's involved people for a very long time. As long as there have been people in the Americas, which some people would say 12,000 years, some people would say 24,000 years, 24,000 years, whatever you say that number is, there have been people living in the Amazon for a long time, and they've been doing a lot of things. So I think it's important to understand that as we look at the Amazon as a whole, and as we look at those questions about what we're going to do.
What's next for you?
Well, I'm off to Bolivia at the end of May for the first time since 2004, so I'm very excited about that. I'm going to spend 6 weeks there and renew some old acquaintances and try and get started on my next next fieldwork project, which will be not far away from some of these pictures that we saw, and trying to get a handle on that, on some of the places. We've seen places where these fields are just obvious, you can't miss them from the air, but we know that they're out there in other places. I want to look at some of the places in between where we haven't spent much time.
How do you do that? Do you actually go on foot? Do you take vehicles? How do you actually go and look for those things?
Well, at first, when I went down there for my, as a determined graduate student to go do my field research to get my doctorate, I was sure I was going to buy a motorcycle. That was budgeted in my project. Now, I've never driven a motorcycle. I hate driving a car. But I got down there, and everybody said, a motorcycle's not going to help you. You need a horse. And so I thought about it, and I said, well, a horse would be about $1,000 cheaper. And so I got a horse, and the horse is great because if you're like me, you're not really paying attention. You're looking at the the things that you're looking for on the ground, and you're looking up at that bird.
And hopefully the horse is paying attention.
And the horse is paying a lot more attention than I did. So the horse never threw me, and I'm sure I would have gotten in many accidents if I was on a motorcycle.
Well, thank goodness for the horse. Well, you'll have to come back and let us know what you found.
I would like that very much.
Dr. John Walker, thank you so much for joining us, and
You're
thank
welcome.
you for joining us. We hope to see you next time again on UCF Profiles. Bye-bye.